Hi, welcome to Lies and Secrets channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching The Secret Night with My Ex That Ended My Marriage. Find out what happens next. Watch all the way through before we dive in. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow through the sheer curtains of our bedroom. I stood there, my heart pounding like a drum, staring at the empty space beside me on the bed. It was a space that once held warmth, laughter, and the gentle breathing of Edward, my husband. But now it was just a cold, empty reminder of what we had lost. I remember the day I first felt the shift. Edward's eyes no longer lit up. When I walked into the room, his touch became mechanical, devoid of the passion we once shared. It was as if he was there but not really there, lost in a world where I no longer existed. That's when the loneliness crept in like a silent intruder, filling the void he left behind. Liam, my ex, was the last person I expected to turn to. Our past was complicated, filled with fiery arguments and even fiercer reconciliations. But when I reached out, desperate for connection, he was there. His apartment was a stark contrast to the sterile environment I had grown accustomed to at home. It was chaotic, filled with art, music, and life. One evening, after too much wine and too many shared stories of our past, Liam introduced me to his dog, a large friendly beast named Max. The night took an unexpected turn, one that I would never have imagined in my wildest dreams. It was an act of desperation, a search for something raw, something real. The next morning I left Liam's place with a mix of guilt and a strange sense of liberation. I thought I could keep it a secret that this one night would be my escape, my little rebellion against the numbness of my marriage. But secrets like shadows have a way of growing larger in the dark. A year passed and I had almost convinced myself that what happened was just a fleeting moment of madness until Edward, with a look of betrayal and pain, confronted me. He had found out how I didn't know, but the look in his eyes told me everything. The trust we had built over years was now shattered, lying in pieces at our feet. As I stood there, the silence between us was deafening. I knew then that the choices I made had led us to this precipice, and now we were both falling with no idea where we would land. I tried to speak, but words failed me. Edward's gaze was like a heavy weight, pinning me to the spot. He didn't yell, didn't scream. The silence was his weapon, and it cut deeper than any words could. "I need some air," he finally said, his voice a mere whisper, yet it echoed in the emptiness of our room. He turned and walked away, leaving me with the remnants of our life together, now scattered like ashes. After a fire, the days that followed were a blur. Edward moved out, taking only what he needed, leaving behind the life we had built. I was left to navigate through the remnants of our marriage. Each room in our house, a testament to what once was the kitchen where we cooked together, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The living room where we watched movies now echoed with the absence of laughter. I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would numb the pain. But every evening as I returned to an empty home, the reality of my solitude hit me like a wave. I started to question my choices. The desperation that led me to Liam to that night, was it worth it? The thrill of the moment had long faded, leaving behind only regret and a hollow feeling in my ***T. One evening I found myself at a local cafe seeking solace in the anonymity of the crowd. There I saw Liam sitting alone. His usual vibrancy dimmed, our eyes met, and for a moment I considered joining him. But the weight of what had happened, what I had done, kept me rooted to my seat. He looked away first, perhaps sensing the storm within me. My phone buzzed, breaking my reverie. It was a message from Edward asking if we could meet to discuss the divorce. My heart sank further. The finality of the word divorce felt like a physical blow. I agreed to meet him, knowing that this conversation would seal the fate of our relationship. As I prepared for the meeting, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Here I was about to discuss the end of my marriage, while the very act that led to this moment was shrouded in secrecy and shame. The complexity of my emotions was overwhelming: guilt, sorrow, and a lingering sense of betrayal towards myself and Edward. The cafe where we agreed to meet was neutral ground, a place neither of us frequented. I arrived early, choosing a secluded table in the back. The wait was torturous. Each tick of the clock, a reminder of the impending conversation. When Edward finally walked in, his face was a mask of resolve, but his eyes betrayed the hurt he was trying to conceal. We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice steady but low. "I think it's best if we handle this amicably, Charlotte, for both our sakes." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Agree. I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The discussion was clinical, discussing assets, living arrangements, and the logistics of separation. But beneath the surface there was an undercurrent of pain, a shared history that couldn't be easily discarded. As we finalized our plans, I realized that the end of our marriage was not just about infidelity. It was about the gradual erosion of love, the silence that grew louder than any argument, and the choices we made in the shadows of our discontent. As we parted ways at the cafe, the weight of our conversation lingered in the air like a heavy fog. I walked out into the cool evening, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, mirroring the darkness that now enveloped my life. The thought of returning to an empty house was suffocating, so I wandered aimlessly, each step echoing the emptiness inside me. My mind replayed the moments with Edward, the subtle signs of our drifting apart that I had ignored the nights spent alone. Even when he was beside me, the realization hit me hard. Perhaps I had been seeking an escape long before that night, with Liam and Max. I found myself outside a small, dimly lit bar, the kind where stories of heartache and redemption are whispered over glasses of whiskey. I pushed the door open, the warmth and murmur of voices, offering a temporary refuge from my solitude. Inside I ordered a drink, my eyes scanning the room not for company, but for a distraction. That's when I noticed a woman at the end of the bar, her gaze fixed on me. She was older, her eyes holding a depth of experience that seemed to see right through my facade. "You look like you've seen better days," she said, her voice smooth, almost comforting. I managed a weak smile. "You could say that." She slid over her presence, oddly comforting. "I'm Evelyn." She introduced herself, extending a hand adorned with rings that told stories of their own Charlotte. I replied, shaking her hand, feeling an unexpected connection. Evelyn listened as I poured out my story, not the details of my infidelity, but the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in my own marriage. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a knowing sadness. "Sometimes we look for warmth in the wrong places," she mused, swirling her drink. "But it's never too late to find where you truly belong." Her words struck a chord. I had been so focused on the betrayal, on the act itself, that I hadn't considered the deeper issues, the void I was trying to fill. As the night deepened, Evelyn shared her own tales of love, lost and found, of mistakes and redemption. Her stories were not of triumph, but of survival, of learning to live with one's choices. "I've learned," she said, her voice steady, "that sometimes the hardest part isn't the fall, but picking yourself back up." Her words echoed in my mind as I left the bar, the night air crisp against my flushed cheeks. I walked home with a new perspective, not of justification for my actions, but of understanding the complexities of human emotion and the desperate need for connection. The next morning I woke up with a resolve to confront not just the aftermath of my infidelity, but the root causes of my discontent. I called Edward not to rehash our separation, but to express something I hadn't before. "Edward, I know this might not change anything, but I want you to know. I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for not seeing us, for not fighting for us when we needed it most." There was a long pause on the other end, the silence heavy with our shared history. "Thank you, Charlotte," he finally said, his voice softer. "I think we both have some healing to do." That conversation didn't mend our broken marriage, but it opened a door to understanding, to perhaps one day finding peace with our past. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, personal growth, and possibly more pain. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, not for reconciliation, but for self-discovery and redemption. As I hung up, I looked around the house, now just a shell of what it once was, yet in its emptiness, there was space for something new, something real. Maybe, just maybe, I could find my way back to myself, to a place where I could be whole, alone or not. The days following my conversation with Edward were a strange mix of relief and turmoil. I found myself oscillating between moments of clarity and deep despair. The house, once filled with our shared life, now felt like a mausoleum of memories, each room echoing with the ghosts of our past. I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air might clear my mind. The streets were quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies the sound of your own footsteps. As I walked, my thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a familiar figure up ahead. It was Liam walking Max, his dog, towards me. My heart skipped a beat, not out of desire, but out of the complex web of emotions that tied us together. He noticed me too, and for a moment we both paused, the distance between us, filled with the weight of our shared secret. "Charlotte," he called out, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and caution. I nodded, my feet rooted to the spot. Liam Max, oblivious to the tension, bounded over his tail, wagging, seeking affection. I bent down, petting him, feeling the warmth of his fur, a stark contrast to the coldness I felt inside. "How are you?" Liam asked, his tone careful, as if navigating through a minefield. "I've been better," I admitted, standing up. "And you?" He shrugged, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Life goes on, I guess, but it's not the Edward." We stood there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Finally I broke it. "I've been thinking a lot about that night, Liam, about us, about what I did." He looked away, then back at me, his eyes searching mine. "I thought about it too. It was unexpected. Sorry if I pushed you into something you weren't ready for." "It wasn't just you," I said, my voice firm. "I was looking for something, anything to feel alive again. But I realized now I was looking in all the wrong places." Liam nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Do you think you'll ever forgive yourself?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my actions heavy on my shoulders. "I'm trying, but it's not just about forgiveness. It's about understanding why I did what I did, why I felt so lost." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Maybe we both need to find a new path, Charlotte, one that leads us to where we're supposed to be, not where we've been." His words resonated with me, echoing Evelyn's from the night before. Maybe I agreed, feeling the stirrings of a resolve within me. As we parted ways, I felt a shift, not just in our relationship but within myself. The encounter with Liam wasn't about reigniting old flames, but about extinguishing them, about closing a chapter that needed to end. Back at home, I sat in the living room, the silence now less oppressive. I picked up a photo album, flipping through the pages, seeing not just the happy moments, but the signs of our unraveling. The smiles seemed forced in some, the distance palpable in others. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reverie. It was Edward, standing there with a box in his hands. His expression was unreadable, a mix of resolve and something softer. "I brought some of your things," he said, placing the box down, "and I wanted to talk." I led him to the kitchen, where we sat at the table, the Edward table where we once shared breakfasts and dreams. The air was charged with the gravity of what was left unsaid. "Charlotte," Edward began, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his inner turmoil. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said on the phone about not fighting for us." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. I realized maybe I stopped fighting too. Maybe we both did, and maybe in our own ways, we were both looking for something we thought was missing. His admission hit me like a wave, the truth of it undeniable. "Think you're right," I whispered, my voice catching. He looked at me, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in a long while. "I'm not saying we can fix this, Charlotte, but maybe understanding why it broke can help us both move forward." The room felt charged with a new kind of energy, not of reconciliation but of understanding and acceptance. "I've been thinking," Edward continued, his voice gaining strength, "about what we both lost and what we might still find, not in each other but within ourselves." The weight of his words settled around us, a poignant reminder of our shared journey. "I've been so focused on the betrayal. I confessed that I didn't see how we both contributed to the emptiness." Edward reached across the table, his hand hesitating before gently touching mine. "I found something in your things," he said, pulling out an old journal. "It was from when we first met." I read some of it and it reminded me of how much we used to share, how much we've lost. Tears welled up in my eyes. As I remembered the journal filled with dreams, plans, and the love we once had. I forgot about that. I whispered, the memories flooding back. He opened it to a page where I had written about our first date, the excitement, the promise of a future together. We were so full of life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maybe we can find that again, not with each other but for ourselves. The air seemed to shift, the room no longer just a place of loss but a space for potential growth. I want to start over, Edward, not with you but with me. I need to find out who I am without the weight of our past. He nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and hope. I think that's what we both need, to find our own paths to heal, and maybe, just maybe, to forgive. As we talked, the conversation flowed into areas we had long avoided. We spoke of our individual dreams, the parts of ourselves we had neglected in the relationship. Edward talked about his desire to travel, to explore the world, something he had always put on hold. I shared my wish to go back to school to pursue a career in art therapy, a passion I had buried under the responsibilities of marriage. The climax of our story wasn't in a dramatic confrontation or a tearful reconciliation. It was in this quiet, profound moment of mutual understanding where we both acknowledged the end of our marriage, but also the beginning of our individual journeys. I want you to have this, Edward said, sliding the journal back to me. Maybe it can remind you of who you were and who you can still become. I took the journal, feeling its weight not just of paper, but of our shared history. Thank you, Edward, for everything. He stood up the chair, scraping softly against the floor. I'll always care about you, Charlotte. I hope you find what you're looking for. As he left, the door closing behind him felt like the final chapter of our book together. But as I sat there alone with my thoughts, I realized this was also the beginning of my own story. The house, once a symbol of our broken dreams, now seemed like a canvas waiting for new strokes of color, new stories to be written. The climax of my infidelity story wasn't about the act itself or the discovery, but about the profound realization that life, love, and self-discovery are ongoing processes. It was about understanding that sometimes the most significant growth comes from the deepest falls. And as I sat there, the journal in my lap, I felt a resolve to paint my life anew with colors of my own choosing, not defined by past mistakes, but by future possibilities. In the weeks that followed, the house began to transform. I started by clearing out the remnants of our past, not just the physical clutter, but the emotional baggage that weighed down every corner. Each piece of furniture, every photograph was a decision, a step towards reclaiming my space, my life. I enrolled in art therapy classes, finding solace in the act of creation. The studio was a sanctuary where I could pour out my emotions onto canvas, each stroke a release, each color a step towards healing. The other students, each with their own stories of pain and recovery, became a sort of family, a network of support I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, after a particularly intense session, I found myself lingering in the studio, the last to leave. The instructor, a woman named Lila, with eyes that seemed to understand the unspoken, approached me. You've been pouring your heart into your work, Charlotte, she observed, her voice gentle yet firm. I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze. It's therapeutic, I admitted, a half-aisle forming. It's more than that, Lila said, sitting beside me. Art has a way of showing us our truths, doesn't it? What do you see in your paintings? I looked at the canvas before me, a tumultuous mix of dark and light, of chaos and emerging form. I see a journey not just of loss but of finding myself again, of understanding why I made the choices I did. Lila nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions that Charlotte was trying to convey. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening and see you in the next videos.